SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India. SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Let us have a look at the economics of airlines. After all, airlines are a business and every business deals with profit, loss and other economic parameters. So, we are going to look at airline economics with the following points. First, we are going to touch upon what are the factors that govern the economics of an airline. We will delve a bit deep into the various components of the costs that are incurred by an airline. The costs incurred by airlines can be divided into various subcategories. The two main subcategories are the direct operating cost, commonly abbreviated as DOC, and indirect operating cost, which is commonly abbreviated as IOC. So, we will look at the DOC and IOC components of a typical airline. Moving on, economics, as you know, is all about demand and supply. So, we will try to take a look at the factors that affect and influence the demand for an airline service. Whenever we have any business, we definitely need to have some key performance indicators or KPIs. So, these are the measures of the efficiency of the system, and we will look at the measures of the efficiency and productivity of an airline business. Let us start by looking at what governs the economics of an airline. As you all know, this is an industry which is heavily intensive in both capital and resources. A typical transport aircraft that has around 200 seats would cost around 1000 crore rupees, and that is a huge amount to be invested by an airline to set up or to start. Of course, they can lease the aircraft also, but what I am saying is that to enter this business you need to have very deep pockets and you need to have access to several resources. The airline business experiences a lot of changes due to season. We call it as seasonality. Now, this is not just the 4 seasons of the year, summer, winter, autumn, spring. No, it is not that, it is more than that. The seasonality in the airline business can be yearly, it could be weekly, it could be daily, it could even be hourly. So, therefore, seasonality is very important and fine grained in airline operations, and because of the changes that have to be carried out, you have to look at the whole operation from a slightly different angle. This is not like a business where there is a continuous demand throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year. There will be periods of very high demand, wherein the inventory that you have, the aircraft that you have, or the manpower that you have to operate the aircrafts may not be sufficient. You may have to lease in the short term, and there may be some occasions or months or weeks in which the demand is just not there, and during that time you will have to see how to take care of your inventory. The efficiency of the management is very important in any business, but much more so for the airline business, because management decisions, they make a huge difference to the bottom line of an airline. These have to be timely decision making, as well as the correct decisions have to be arrived at with very short notice. The reason for that is airlines operate in a very complex environment which has got several factors that are internal to the airline and also many factors which are external to the airlines. Yield management is a very important concept in economics, and in the airline industry it becomes paramount. So, we are going to spend some specific time in understanding the topics related to yield management. Okay. So, what is yield management? Yield management basically means, what is the yield of an airline? The yield of an airline basically is the kind of revenue that the airline earns. So, if you manage the trip cost, which is the cost incurred in one flight or in one trip, and the cost incurred per mile or per passenger per mile, this has to be very strongly and accurately managed. I would say sometimes it has to be micromanaged, and you need to relate it very strongly in the unit cost and revenue, right. The second thing is that yield management is a function of the load factor versus the break even load factor, normally abbreviated in the airline industry as LF and BELF. Okay. So, what is meant by LF? Load factor basically is the percentage of the capacity that is available, which is utilized overall in the operation of an airline. Let us say there is an airline that operates 10 flights a day and each flight has 200 seats. So, the total capacity available per day is 2000 seats, and let us say if you look at the total number of passengers, in some flights you will have a full load, in some flights you may have half a load, in some you may have in between. So, net let us say over the day you are able to carry 1800 passengers, whereas you could have carried 2000 passengers. So, your load factor overall for the day will be 90%, 1800 divided by 2000. Similarly, you can do this per flight, you can do the load factor calculation per day, per season, per year. It basically represents on how much you can carry, and with respect to that how much you actually did carry. The break even load factor is the average load factor that allows you to recover all your expenses, and any passenger that goes above the break even load factor is giving you clearly the profit. So, it is not enough to have high load factor by filling the aircraft. If your break even load factor is 80%, which is a very high number by the way, then you have to consistently maintain the load factor above 85 or above 80 to ensure that you get some profit. On the other hand, if you do some planning and if you take some initiatives in such a way that you bring down the break even load factor to say 60% or 50%, then you only have to go half full to recover your costs or 60% full to recover your costs, and anything above that is going to give you profit. So, it is not just important that you should have high load factors. Just by ensuring that the aircraft flies full, which means just by ensuring high load factors, you do not mean profits. It is a balance between the load factor that you operate and the break even load factor that you have to count. Now, the load factor that you operate is a function of how much market you can capture, and the break even load factor depends upon how well you manage and run the airline, Of course, there are many external factors even which push the break-even load factor high, but by careful management and by planning you might be able to hit the BELF and bring it down, thus increasing your profitability. So, now let us delve a little bit deep into the costs of an airline. Okay. Let us look at what determines the cost of an airline or airlines. Okay. First thing you have to understand is that the price that you charge the customer, this is directly related to the stage length that you operate or the distance between the origin and destination, right. And also it is a function of the relative operating cost or COPER that you incur. So, you cannot charge any price. You have to ensure that whatever price you charge, on an average it is higher than the operating cost. Otherwise, if your operating cost is very high, then you will have to charge very high prices to be able to remain profitable. And moreover, if you are traveling a small stage length, unfortunately you are going to encounter higher costs per seat per mile, because the distance that you are traveling is small. Similarly, if you are traveling with less number of passengers, if your capacity is less, there are certain routes in which you cannot get more than some 50-20 passengers. So, in those routes it will be foolish in my opinion to operate very large aircraft. Okay. You should operate aircraft which are suitable for the sector which you fly. Another problem is that there are certain subsidies which are available to an airline in some countries on social obligation routes. We have already discussed the growth of air transportation in evolving economies, and we have also seen how various schemes are announced by the government to encourage airlines to offer seats on certain routes which may not necessarily have a business case or a demand for travel. Okay. But because you can get subsidies, those subsidies can give you some financial benefit. So, although there will be high operating cost on these routes because you are likely to get less number of passengers, you are required to operate so that you can cross subsidize the operation on the other routes. Then you have to look at the various operating scenarios in which you are operating. There are some distribution costs which are a big portion of the total cost an airline occurs. The distribution costs are involved with the ability to actually announce and provide the service through the help of travel agents and through the help of other agencies which allow you. All these online reservation systems, all of them are costs, they do not come cheap, they are expensive and the airline has to incur expenditure, but unless the airline does that, how will the people know which flights are available, how many seats are available. So, distribution costs are a must. Then there are overheads. Overheads are administrative costs which are related to being in business and operating an airline, even though it may not be directly connected to the extent of operations and the amount of flight hours that you operate. Because you are in business, there are certain overheads you have to cater for. Then we have to look at the cost incurred by the airline is a function of what kind of product the airline is offering. So, airline as a service, basically it is supposed to just transport passengers from A to B and also to transport cargo from A to B. But while the entire cargo that an airline carries goes in the belly of the aircraft in the space available for cargo transportation, the way in which you present yourself and the kind of services and products that you offer in the passenger cabin, it differs a lot. Okay. So, in general, in any airline you will see there are 4 classes possible in seating and there can be combinations in between also. A typical transcontinental airline runs these classes, the highest level of comfort and luxury that you can offer to a passenger is in the first class. So, in the first class you give huge amount of facilities and luxury, but you also can charge a very large amount. This first class is reserved for passengers who can afford to pay for the facilities and luxuries that you offer. The next level is business class. In business class, the level of comfort and the facilities are little bit lower than that in the first class, but much better, and there are in the business class the facilities which are on offer are a shade lower than in the first class, but far better than those offered in the economy class. Now, in economy class you can see the seats are more in number, the seat pitch or the gap between two seats is much lower, but there also many airlines they offer little bit higher comfort compared to the economy class, but lower than the business class, and that is called as the premium economy class. Not every airlines offer it. And then the lowest level of category in which most passengers fly is the economy class. Now, I am not saying that all airlines offer these categories. There are some airlines which have the complete cabin only in single class, the economy class. So, it can be full economy class. There are many airlines which operate only full economy class. There are some which may also operate complete aircraft is in business class. It could be, but most airlines, especially on long distance route, transcontinental routes, they generally offer a mix of these classes. So, in most domestic airlines you will see a few seats in the front which is the business class, and majority seats will be the economy class. In some domestic airlines you will see the business class, then you have a premium economy, and then you have the economy class. In some you will see that there is a first class which is normally in the front of the cabin, which much more luxurious facilities, as we will see. Let us look at some classes in seating. So, here is a picture that shows you the first class of a typical airline. This is an image of a demonstration of the aircraft interiors by Etihad Airways in 2017. Notice that the space available for the passenger is almost like a small room in an apartment. You have all kinds of facilities, you have a nice full wall sized television, huge window, and you have a table of your own where luxurious food is served, and you can see that it is like a small, as I said, small house, and there is a long comfortable bed which can be used by you. This is the first class, the most expensive one. Then we have the business class. In business class, which is tailor made for people who travel on business, one of the main things that you offer is the ability for the passenger to have a proper good night's sleep, so that they can arrive at the destination in a very comfortable fashion. Most business class passengers are able to attend to their business at the destination immediately after travelling an intercontinental route, and what they pay as extra fare perhaps will offset the charges that they may have to pay for accommodation when they reach the destination. So, for some people business class works out to be net affordable and preferable mode of travel. And then we have the economy class. This is from the Emirates Boeing 777. So, there you see that there are many more seats across the width of the fuselage of the aircraft, and far more people are crammed into the space available, but the fares are also very low. Now, this is the most common class, and the largest number of seats in the airline are normally in the economy class, and as I said, the fares also are least. But not only are the fares low, the option, the facilities, the baggage you can carry, the amount of food you get, the quality of the food you get, all that is the lowest in the economy class. So, in between there is a class called as a premium economy class. As I said, many airlines operate a premium economy class. So, there the seats are wider than those in the economy class, the comfort levels are higher, the options and the facilities available, the type of headrest available, all those, the type of hand rest available is also much better. You will find less number of people sitting across the fuselage width in the premium economy class as compared to the economy class. Now, many airlines offer a combination of these, they give fancy names to it, they offer certain facilities and features, and that is basically the product differentiation that they offer as a competition in the airline industry. Moving ahead, let us have a look at why we should define the cost structures when we look at airline economics. Why is it needed? Okay. Basically, the cost structures are required because it helps in accountability, both as an accountant as well as a management. Okay. So, it is an accounting and management tool. Cost structures can help us to measure the cost versus the operating efficiency of an airline. So, it gives management a deeper insight into the way in which the organization is operating and whether there are any areas that need attention or changes. It helps if you have cost structures to measure operating and non-operating profit and loss. So, we all know what is meant by profit and loss. Operating and non-operating basically means that whether an airline is operating or it is currently not operating, okay, we need to realize that there could be profit and there could be loss in both the scenarios. Then there are certain productivity ratios which allow us to compare our performance against the performance of the competitor. So, when you have cost structures very well defined and ratios properly defined, you can comment on the productivity of a particular airline as compared to the other airline. So, one productivity ratio which is quite commonly discussed is the total number of aircraft that an airline operates divided by the total manpower that is employed by the company. So, how many people per aircraft of operation? So, some airlines have a very high value, some airlines have a very small value of this particular productivity ratio. Then when we define the cost structures carefully and when the management has a proper insight into the cost structures, this can help in arriving at a mechanism or a means to decide how much we should charge for the product and services offered. As I mentioned, in the first class there are many more facilities and services offered to an airline customer as compared to the economy class. So, therefore, the fare to be charged for the first class has to be multiple times more than the fare charge for the economy class passenger. How much should it be? Should it be 2 times, 3 times, 1.5 times? You can determine that if you actually are able to come up with a number for the various, the cost for the various facilities you are giving, and therefore it helps in determining how much to charge. Okay. So, price is something that gets decided based on the products and services which are offered. So, let us see how the airline costs can be categorized. As I mentioned, the two main heads under which operating costs of the airline can be classified is the direct operating cost or DOC. Okay. This is a cost of operation that is directly connected with operations. So, if the airline stops to operate, let us say an airline does not fly a particular route, then in the short term you can definitely reduce your operating cost because you are not flying in that route. Okay. Since you are not operating, you are not incurring any cost. Of course, you do not have revenue also, but you are not incurring any cost. Okay. On the other hand, there are some cost terms which come under the indirect operating cost. These are the ones that you will have to incur even if you cut down on your operations, and also if you scale up your operations, you may not necessarily incur too much additional indirect operating costs. So, it works both ways. The costs which is incurred in support operations for the airlines, such as the legal department of an airline, their expenses are going to be broadly speaking the same whether you operate or not. Then there are many indirect costs which have to be incurred, and if you, for example, rent an office space in a particular airport because you are operating from there and you do not operate for, let us say, 3 months or 4 months, you may shut down the office, but you still will have to pay the rent. So, these kind of indirect costs are there. Now, if you look at the DOC or the direct operating cost, this is actually studied much deeper in air transportation, because this is something that the airline can, broadly speaking, have a handle on and can control slightly, and one can adjust the operations of an airline to tweak the value of the direct operating cost. So, you can further classify this operating cost as a variable cost, and these are the ones which are related to the flight operations, and they are not incurred if the no operations or the demand fluctuates. Okay. So, these are the variable costs, and then there are fixed costs. These are the costs which are connected to the airline operations. If you are an airline, you will incur these fixed costs, and they are not directly related if operations are increased or decreased, because they are not connected to the flight operations. So, therefore, they are incurred irrespective of flight operations. So, there are two ways of looking at it. Okay. One could say, okay, there is a clear cut differentiation between the direct operating cost and the indirect operating cost, or one can say no, one can look also at variable costs and fixed costs. Okay. So, let us look at the variable component of the DOC. Fuel and oil, this is the one that allows the aircraft to fly, and this can be a huge component. Generally, it is a very major component of the operating cost of an airline. And then you have maintenance cost excluding spares, which could also be a very large component, because aircraft have to be maintained to ensure safe and timely operations, and therefore, certain amount of costs towards labor, towards material have to be incurred. Some are incurred after every flight, some are incurred once at the end of the day. So, the activity of maintenance is divided into various types, and we will discuss that in more details later on. Then you have expenses related to the operation which have to be paid to the government or the airport. So, you have landing charges, you have route navigation and facilitation charges, or RNFC as it is called. This is basically for providing the air traffic control services and air traffic management facilities. And then you have the passenger handling charges, which are charged either based on the total number of seats that are available on the aircraft or the number of passengers that you have actually flown. Then you have to cater for the salaries and allowances of the crew members. There could be three kinds of crew members. There could be crew members who are in the passenger cabin, there could be crew members who are in the flight cabin. Then every airline generally has to provide some basic catering and some other amenities like newspapers and magazines. All of that will also cost. So, these are the passenger facilities that have to be provided. Then when your crew member go to another station and they will have to stay for the night sometimes. So, there are expenses related to the travel and the hotel expenses for the crew members. These are much more in long distance transcontinental flights, because there are limits specified by the regulatory agencies on how many hours you can expect a person to do the duty while operating as a crew of an airline. Then as I mentioned, there are some distribution costs or costs related to ensuring that your seats are occupied and sold out. For that you have to give commission to travel agents, it could be online or it could be offline, whatever it may be. So, those costs are also variable. Then what are the fixed components of DOC? For example, the aircraft acquisition cost. When you acquire an aircraft to be operated by your airline, you could either go for procurement, you could either go for procurement of the aircraft, or you may go for leasing the aircraft. When you lease an aircraft, again there are many options in leasing. There is a wet lease, there is a dry lease, there is a moist lease, there are many kinds of leases. But basically when you lease the aircraft, you do not own the aircraft, you are just taking it on loan or you are borrowing it from a company, and yes, you are going to pay the finance charges for using that aircraft. Then aircraft have to be insured both for loss of the hull or the body and the components, and also the passengers and the crew members who are on board. So, for that you have to incur some cost, and that cost has to be incurred even if you are not flying. The moment you lease or own an aircraft, you have an asset with you. If you do not operate, if you do not fly, then that asset is there, it is gathering dust, but you are going to incur expenditure because you have to take care of the insurance. As I said, this insurance is for the hull or for the body, for the passengers and the staff members. Then whenever you run a maintenance organization, you need to have the support of some staff members who will be there in the maintenance setup. Earlier this used to be called as maintenance burden, but nowadays we do not use that word because actually it is not a burden, it is required. Without the help of the maintenance personnel, we cannot this is not people who do direct maintenance on the aircraft or on the engine or on the avionics. These are people who are there in the maintenance department. So, there are some expenses in the overheads of the maintenance department. Then the operating staff, both on the airport, in the passenger cabin, in the flight cabin, all of them have to be given salaries. As I mentioned, the reservation systems which are used to book the seats or to book the cargo, they also are going to cost. Now, they are not going to be charged based on how many seats are booked. This is because you have an ability to book, you are going to pay some fixed charges and they are going to be there, whether one passenger takes the booking or 25 passengers take the booking, there is going to be a minimum expenditure on the reservations. As I mentioned, every airline generally maintains an office or some presence for the maintenance in the airport, and those airport premises have to be rented, and whether or not you operate, they have to be the rent has to be paid out. Let us look at now the components of indirect operating cost, the other way of looking at it. So, the cost of office space, the cost of promoting and advertising an airline, the cost of providing a communications network to ensure that passengers are able to communicate with the airline website, and also the cost of getting the bookings, etc. Then there are some legal costs. You always have to have a legal department, or you may have some people on retainership who will look after all your legal issues. Then there are many other administrative and overhead costs which have to be incurred. So, now the important thing is that the unit operating cost versus the number of passengers you carry for the same stage length actually is a function of the aircraft type you operate and the kind of service that you offer. So, here is an aircraft Dornier 228 NG, which is a small 18-seater aircraft, and let us compare this with a large aircraft. In this case, it is the Airbus A321. Imagine that both of them are being used for a particular route. Okay. Both of them are being used for a particular route, so the same stage length is on offer. So, in case of the Dornier 228 NG, which is the 19-seater aircraft, the unit operating cost per kilometer is going to be higher, because the total operating cost is going to be recovered only over the number of people who are present. Even if you assume that the aircraft is full, there will be 19 passengers. So, the operating cost will be divided by 19. On the other hand, since the Airbus A321neo is going to have 190 passengers, the operating cost of that will be higher than that for the Dornier 228 aircraft. However, since large number of people are in the denominator, the per person unit operating cost is going to be much lower. So, by virtue of being a small aircraft with less capacity, a Dornier 228 is going to definitely have a lower unit operating cost. However, if you look at the overheads, the amount of money incurred per trip, you will find that it will be much lower for Dornier 228 aircraft, because they will mostly operate a no frills service. So, they will not have many facilities, many features, many privileges available on the aircraft, as compared to an Airbus A321neo, which will have a higher quality of service, and therefore, it will incur higher overheads per trip. Let us have a look at how airlines can control their costs to some extent. Okay. Now, there are certain factors which just cannot be influenced by the airline. We should first understand what kind of factors these are. The cost incurred on the fuel and oil is completely dependent on the rate that is charged by the oil companies, and this can go up and down. An airline can do some hedging to ensure that there is not too much of dependence on the market rate, but there is a limit to how much you can hedge. The landing, RNFC and PAX handling charges, usually there is a kind of a standardization, at least country wide or region wise there is a fixed number, but it is at the purview but it depends on the agency that provides these services, and these charges can also be changed. Crew salaries and allowances, are generally driven by the market rates. So, there cannot be too much variation in the crew salaries between your crew and the crew of the competing airlines, because then you are going to lose your crew members. But having said that, there are certain factors which can't be controlled by the airline. There are definitely some factors which the airline can control, and this is where they invest their energy in the economic management of the airline. Airline can actually choose what type and how old or how young the aircraft they can operate. The airline can decide what type of aircraft they are going to operate, and also the age of the aircraft. Some airlines are interested in having young fleet. So, their logic is that young fleet will require lower maintenance, it will have better aerodynamic performance, and it will consume less fuel. So, we will utilize them very heavily for few years, 4, 5 years, and then sell them to the airlines. So, we may incur a larger cost in leasing or buying these aircraft, but we can get more out of them when they are young. After a few years, the maintenance costs start building up, we would be out of the ownership by that time. Similarly, an airline can decide which type of aircraft that they will fly on a particular route. For example, some airline might say that on these routes we will operate twin turboprop commuter and regional aircraft, because the market is not so ripe and the number of seats available are lower, and on the other trunk routes or on the major routes we will operate larger aircraft. But then you have to have maintenance personnel qualified, you need to have the pilots qualified and the cabin crew qualified to operate more types of aircraft. So, some airlines have taken a decision that they will operate a single aircraft type on all the routes. So, it is up to an airline. Okay. So, this way you can control the fuel and maintenance cost economics. Then the distribution cost can also be handled or managed by an airline to some extent. The product cost is completely up to the airline. How much they charge for a particular route is completely up to them. Once again, you cannot be too much different and away from the competitor, especially when you are offering the seats in economy class. The cost of a seat in economy class by airline A cannot be too much different from airline B, because the market will dictate that if the facilities are similar, then people will travel by any of the two airlines which offers a lower fare. And then to some extent you can also determine the overhead costs. That depends upon the kind of system that you have in place and what kind of procedures you are following. By that you can actually control the overhead cost to some extent. Let us see what are the measures followed by airlines for lowering their costs. The first important point is cost reduction via technology gains. There are some airlines who are very proactively looking at new technology, and they adopt the technology very quickly, and with that they go for cost reduction, as I mentioned, at the cost of higher procurement price, but because there are technological gains available, it might be possible for you to recover those high costs by operating more efficiently. I already told you that there are many airlines which have a policy of going for modern and young fleet of aircraft, so that the operating cost economies are lower, whereas the initial cost and the cost of loans and servicing the loan may be high, but they are okay with that. They would like the operating cost to be low. Another way in which an airline can reduce its costs is outsourcing. Why should all airlines do all aspects of their business on their own? There are many examples in which we see that a particular airline has only 1 or 2 flights a week from a particular airport to their destination. Instead of hiring a full time staff and using them only twice a week, they enter an agreement with another airline and tell them that you give us help with your staff to run our operations without the need for us to transport or station many people at the destination or at the origin station, because there are many airlines which enter an agreement with other airlines, sometimes even competing airlines, so that they can use their surplus staff for their operations, and it will be meaningless for them to appoint too many people for servicing those very lean routes. So, many activities of the airlines can be outsourced as approved by the regulatory bodies. Re-engineering and downsizing are two key words in modern day industry parlance, where you can reduce the operating costs. There are pros and cons of this, but it is best left to the management of the airline to decide which options and features they are going to follow. Let us see how the unit operating cost, that is the cost per passenger or cost per passenger per kilometer, changes with the stage length or L stage. In general, this is how it varies, where the x axis is the stage length or the distance from the origin to the destination of the aircraft, and the y axis is the operating cost per kilometer. So, we notice that if your stage length is low, you are going to have very high operating cost per kilometer, you cannot avoid it. But as you increase your stage length, you see that there is a decrease in the operating cost per kilometer, but then you reach a minimum, below that you just can't have. So, as the distance between two city or city pairs becomes shorter, the per unit distance operating cost increases. Let us move on to the demand of an airline. What are the factors that drive the demand of an airline? The distance between city pairs. If two city pairs are farther apart, there is a higher propensity for air travel. If the city pairs are near each other, the propensity for air travel generally becomes low, unless there are certain specific circumstances. So, for instance, if you look at two towns which are near each other, people will be much more prone to use their own automobile or a rented car or a rail connection to travel. But for a very long distance between two cities, other modes of transport offer no competition at all. There is no way you can say that from Mumbai to Washington DC I will travel by road, no way. You might take, I do not know, a month to reach there. The other important factor that is a huge driver for inter-city demand is the business links and the interaction between city pairs. Okay. Another important factor that drives demand is the convenience of air travel versus other modes. For example, if you look at island to island transportation, if you go by ship, it might take a lot of time and effort, although it will work out to be less expensive per seat per kilometer, but it will be so much time consuming that people would prefer to fly by air. Or if there is a huge problem in connectivity, sometimes you will find that there is no direct route by rail or by train, there is a very indirect route available. So, in those cases also travel by air is important. An example of this is in the northeast India, where we have a very small piece of land called the Chicken's Neck that connects the eastern part of the country, the Seven Sisters, with the West Bengal area. Everybody who travels by rail or by road has to go via that Chicken's Neck to reach, but aircraft can fly over Bangladesh and reach there much faster. So, you will see that there will be a higher propensity for air travel as compared to other modes in northeastern region of India. People also look at how much is the time and the money saved when I travel by air compared to other modes of transport, and that becomes a big driver. And then what is the price charged by a particular mode of transportation? If the airfares become less and start becoming almost like a air conditioned class train fares, people will move to aircraft because it does not make sense in travelling by road. Recently I made a trip to Goa from Mumbai. I used the Tejas Express and I realized that the air ticket was not more than the train ticket. The flight took about, so when I came back by air and I paid almost the same amount to travel by air. Of course, I had to pay a higher taxi fare, but even when I travel to the railway station at both Goa as well as in Mumbai, I need to pay taxi fare. So, net I found that it was cheaper for me to travel by air compared to travelling by Tejas Express. But the reason I went by Tejas Express was because I wanted to experience Tejas Express. It was my first journey by that mode of the transportation offered by the railways. Okay. So, yeah, you can get very beautiful panoramic views, you can have a nice table in front of you, you can do your work. I was constantly enjoying my travel. Okay. But there are pluses and minuses for both. So, people look at what is the price that you have to pay, and then people have to look at the time and the money saved. Okay. Price, of course, as I mentioned to you. Then there is a extent of available disposable incomes. When you have more disposable income, more and more people travel as leisure passengers, and that drives the demand for travel. Okay. So, the contribution and increase in leisure traffic directly puts a pressure on the yields or the income that the airline has, and that is a function of the price and income sensitivity of the passengers. So, all these factors are interrelated. Another interesting factor to be kept in mind is that today we are much more informed and much more aware about the facilities available and the tourist attractions in other places because of the growth of the availability of internet connectivity, due to which the knowledge of a faraway location is known to you. Earlier we were not aware and therefore we had no propensity for travel, but now more information is available and there are people who post on Instagram and on Twitter and on some other websites the pictures and the information regarding the destinations, and with that the information and knowledge also starts traveling. Let us look at what are the measures that an airline will follow, or how do we measure demand in air transportation systems. First measure is the extent of affluence. As I mentioned, larger the disposable income, more the propensity for travel. Then we look at the origin and destination traffic statistics. Actually, how many people travel between A to B, whatever be the mode of transportation, how much do they travel, and if we find that there is a niche which can be taken care by air transportation, that can help in estimating the demand. You have to also look at the convenience of flying and the frequency at which you offer the flights. Sometimes it may be possible for you to capture a bigger market from other modes of transport if you offer a good enough frequency, and also if the flying becomes convenient. If there are for example, there is a new airport in Goa at Mopa, and because of that there is a higher propensity for the northern Goa residents to travel out, because there is a new airport available now. Then there are many macroeconomic environmental impacts, and these lead to increase in the demand. We call them as the trickle down factors of the environment. Then one has to very carefully evaluate what are the external factors that influence the travel demand. Okay. Finally, you have to look at the range of forecasts. So, many assumptions are made, and based on the assumptions things like at this rate economy will grow, therefore there will be higher business, therefore there will be more propensity for business travel. These kind of projections are made, and if you look at both the major aircraft manufacturers, Airbus and Boeing, on their website they always publish a market outlook for the future, global market forecast and outlook for the future, and they actually have a team of researchers who are constantly monitoring the global economy and looking at the various factors, and they give their own prognosis on these websites. We have to also be very careful about the effect on the travel demand by prospective developments of other surface modes. The moment government plans a freeway or much better connectivity between major cities, and if they really come into fruition, you will find that it will start affecting the demand for travel by airlines. The Government of India, for example, is planning to connect the metro cities through these super high speed highways. When that really comes into being, it is claimed that one can travel from Mumbai to New Delhi in about 12 hours. Now, I am not saying that all passengers who travel by air will shift to this mode of transport, because 12 hours by road is still very inconvenient. Okay. However, if you have certain tasks on the way, it might be better and it might be more affordable for a person to go by road compared to going by air. So, it all depends. I mean, one cannot make a very fixed or a clear cut prediction. This is all based on what is expected to happen in the future. When you are calculating the demand or estimating the demand, it is very important to have reliable and dependable data sources and methods, so that you can take care of the uncertainty. There will always be some uncertainty in demand prediction, one cannot make it perfectly certain, because certain things can happen which will change the whole dynamics completely. However, if the data source and the factors are carefully chosen, then these methods can actually give you a very good estimate for demand prediction with least amount of uncertainty. Let us look at what are the basic determinants of demand which drive the demand. Okay. So, demand is driven by who is traveling, what nationality, whether it is an adult or child, whether it is a male or female. There are certain countries or certain nationalities which have a higher propensity for travel. For example, it is well known that people in the USA, they travel a lot by air because they are used to it and they have seen it from many years ago, compared to people, let us say, in Africa or in some other developing economy. Adults travel more than children. Okay. About male or female, I cannot just say, it depends, it varies from region to region. How do the people travel? That determines the demand. Are they travelling by scheduled airlines or by chartered airlines? Scheduled airlines are the ones which publish their schedule and you book the ticket on them depending on the availability. Chartered airlines are the ones that operate on specific routes, on specific times of the year and seasons, because there is a huge demand for travel. Generally it is for the tourist travels. For example, Goa is the destination in India which is very popular by tourists. So, there are quite a large number of chartered flights coming to Goa during the peak tourist season. Then we have to also look at which airline is being chosen by the passengers, because the market share of the airline also is affected by the and also interline traffic, which is the traffic between connectivity or the passing on of traffic between one airline to the other. Where do people travel? What are the locations? So, mostly people travel to the hubs, from one hub or the gateways. Then there are certain routes which have a very good origin destination demand. Okay. So, the people are travelling from that particular place A to that particular place B because people from A want to travel to B, not because people have to transit via A to go to B or transit via B to go to A. That is a true origin destination. Then frequency of visits, there are certain places where people travel more frequently and those areas get higher demand. Then, as I mentioned, this business is a business which is completely affected by seasonality, depending on where the annual traffic is growing, depending on the time of the day. There are certain times, for example, business travelers normally would like to travel early morning and come back late evening, so that they can be at their homes, they can avoid spending the night outside. So, there is a huge amount of demand for travel during early morning peak hours and late evening peak hours. On the other hand, there may be lesser demand during the daytime, middle of the day or middle of the night. Generally, after about 10-11 o'clock till morning 6 o'clock, there will be less passenger travel demand. Those flights are called as red eye flights, in which you either leave or arrive at a very awkward time when your eyes are red because of fatigue. They are cheaper, they are much more affordable. So, many people, they book red eye flights to save money, but normal average passengers would not like to travel. So, time of the day demand is also a big factor. Then why is somebody traveling? Is it on business? Is it on leisure or pleasure, or is it travel because of some official duties, government travel, or you are assigned to travel for some official work. So, that also determines the demand. And how much is the passenger prepared to pay for the flight. So, fares are driven by the amount passengers can pay. Then there are various classes, as I mentioned, and different level of money is affordable for different people, and with that it can affect how much yield an airline is able to realize. So, all these factors who, how, where, when, why and how much, they affect demand, and therefore, we can call them as the determinants of demand for air travel. What are the methods for calculating or estimating the demand? Okay. One can look at the trends which are projected in the future based on the forecast or the economic forecast. Okay. This is true and believable only when the historical traffic growth has been steady. So, when it is steady, then you can assume or predict that it will further raise. Okay. And also during the study period, we do not expect any major environmental changes, because major environmental changes directly affect the projections. Okay. Then there are some econometric relationships which help us estimate or calculate the demand. When the traffic is influenced by many environmental factors, then one can look at econometric relationships. Then there are surveys carried out by the industry and by the market, which helps us to get a hang on how much will be the expected demand. This is normally done for new markets or immature markets which are slowly building up and they are not fully established. Okay. Now, the end result that is used to calculate the demand by an airline could be a combination of all these factors. They will look at trend projections also, they will look at some econometric relationships also, they will look at surveys by market and industry, and a combination of all of this is what finally is used as a number to predict what is the demand for travel. Now, there is a word of caution here that there could be differing conclusions by different modes of predicting and calculating the demand, but one has to use one's own judgment to consolidate the numbers, and this comes only by experience. This expertise is built up only by experience. Okay. Let us look at price and income elasticity of demand for air travel. Okay. So, what is meant by elasticity? The change in the demand with change in a causal variable. Basically, how much does the demand change in response to change in one particular variable. Okay. So, price and income elasticity of demand is defined based on the changes to GDP and or other prices, right. Now, there was a recent study by NCEAR which showed that the income elasticity is approximately plus 1.1%. That means, the change in the demand based on the change in the income will be around plus 1.1. The price elasticity is minus 0.6%. Okay. So, this gives you directly how much is the effect in the change in the demand if there is a price change. Okay. So, we notice that the income elasticity is more important than price elasticity, because the income elasticity affects the demand much more than price elasticity. This is true for air travel demand. Okay. This is not true for all modes of transport, but for air travel it has been found that the income elasticity is generally much higher. So, let us now look at some measures which are used in the airline parlance for estimating or accounting the efficiency or productivity of an airline, and we will also look at the validity of these measures. So, we can call them as the KPIs of the airline industry or the key performance indicators. One important factor is percentage utilization of the aircraft. So, if an airline has 100 aircraft either on lease or procured and owned, and if 70 of them are being used, 30 of them are not being used for various reasons, because they are down of maintenance, because there is some problem with their operation, then the percentage of aircraft which are used is called as a percentage utilization. This number, as you can expect, should be as high as possible. Then we have the next parameter called as the on time performance. How many times the airline is able to meet its projected or established schedule. Here I must make here I would like to make a remark that on time performance is usually measured. So, on time performance is something that is very much valued by business passengers as compared to the leisure passengers, because business passengers are very sensitive about reaching the destination in time. Then we have technical dispatch reliability. This is a function of how much dependent on operating parameters and weathers is the mode of transportation. So, dispatch reliability should be as high as possible. This is different from utilization, because utilization could be because of some limitations in your operations, or it could be because of non availability of manpower to operate the aircraft. But technical dispatch reliability is a function of how much your operations are hampered by changes in operating scenario or by things like the weather. Then you have per unit yields. Okay. A way of measuring whether the airline is doing things economically in a good fashion or not, revenue passenger kilometers. So, this is like total revenue earned by the airline over a month or over a day or over a given period of time, divided by how many passengers have travelled who pay fare, because airlines sometimes do carry passengers who are not paying. Okay. So, revenue passenger kilometer basically is a measure of how many passengers who are paying fare and per kilometer are available. There is another parameter called as revenue per available seat kilometers. So, here the total revenue that is earned divided by how many passengers could have flown because seats are available over the distance which they flow in on an average. So, these two parameters are you can call them as specific yield. Then you have per unit cost. So, what is the cost incurred by the airline divided by the available seat kilometers? So, if an airline has 20 aircraft, each of them has 100 seats, it has 2000 available seats, and suppose it travels on an average 1000 kilometers, but there are multiple routes available. So, you just take a summation of all of them and you look at the total cost incurred divided by the total summation of the available seat in the kilometers. Many a times the effectiveness of the marketing of an airline is measured by what is the advertising cost as a percentage of gross revenue. So, obviously, this should be as low as possible, and then as I mentioned in the beginning, there is something called as a load factor versus the break even load factor. So, this is another way of finding out whether the KPI of the airline is good or not. Here is an example of how the break even load factor varies with the capacity of the aircraft. So, when you have more seats on board, then the break even load factor becomes lower and lower, because now there are more passengers who are actually going to pay for the services, right. So, as the seat capacity increases, the break even load factor reduces, but this is only true if the seats go full. It is not true that larger aircraft have got a lower BELF, because if there are larger aircraft but less passengers, you are not going to get a lower, assuming that seats are going full. As you have more seats, the break even load factor is going to reduce. There are some other performance indicators which one can look at. For example, how efficiently is the airline able to operate per employee. So, the available seat kilometers per employee is another measurement. Similarly, how much revenue is being earned per kilometer, passenger kilometers, that is another parameter. Then there is an investment that has been made in operating an airline and is giving some returns. What is the ROI? That is another way of measuring. many airlines are also evaluated based on the debt to equity ratio or earnings per share if they are listed on the stock exchange. So, let us look at the basic structure of airline fares. So, you notice that the blue line on the top is showing you the per unit cost, and yes, as we know, the per unit cost is going to reduce as the number of seats increases. The dotted brown line is the per unit yield. Okay. So, we notice that for this particular example, the per unit cost is higher than the per unit yield up to this point. So, this particular point will indicate the profitable region. Beyond this, the operations are going to be profitable. Okay. So, the yields of the airline are governed by the market forces. Therefore, even though the airline is incurring a large amount of cost, you cannot simply charge high values, because if you put your fares very high, since your operating costs are very high, you will find that there are other modes, other airlines available to passengers. Passengers will go to them if you are not able to charge a competitive fare. Therefore, it is very important that for an airline to remain profitable, the cost curve needs to align with the yield curve. Thanks for your attention.